Okay, it's 2 minutes past 12:15, so I think we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome to everyone out there to today's lunch symposium. We are, of course, disappointed that we can't all be together in person, but yet with last night's storm or the storm over the past few days, who knows if we even would have been able to meet together in person. So we're happy to have you here online, and we're hoping to have a really interactive session for you this afternoon. What I'd first like to mention is we have really tried to switch it up between the people speaking at you and actually doing a little bit of polling and interaction here. So we have a link that we're going to set up for you right there in the chat, and we're going to get your feedback throughout the lunch symposium. Throughout every little section, we'll do initially some icebreaker questions, then some setting the scene questions, and then kind of move on to the topics that we cover throughout the lunch symposium. So the title of today's topic is the NFDI, DSI, CBD, alphabet soup. What changes in policies might affect how you use data in the future? So if you can use that link right there in the chat, we'd love to get you started off before we turn it over to Jörg Obermann with just some icebreaker questions. So this is the platform Mindy, and hopefully you should be able to see that right there in front of your screen. And you can actually, this is only showing you the results of the panel. So use the link in the chat on your phone, in your browser, right here, parallel to what we're doing. And the first thing we wanted to just find out from you is, are you aware of some of these broader international discussions around the Convention on Biological Diversity, that's the CBD, the Nagoya Protocol, that's the NP, benefit sharing, which is the idea resulting out of those first two, and then the last acronym, digital sequence information, or DSI. So let us know if you've heard of any of these buzzwords, or if you're a little bit unsure, that's also fine there. That's why we have the sort of answer. So go ahead, fill that in, and let's just get a sense of what the audience is like out there. Are you aware of the international discussions around the Convention on Biological Diversity, the Nagoya Protocol, benefit sharing, and digital sequence information? All right, so we got about 25% no and yes. I see there's some known people in the audience, so that's perhaps not so surprising, but that's great. We have a good basis for our discussion here today. I only see 5 people over in the poll. So if you're able to, it'd be great if you can jump over there and get into the poll and keep adding in. So let's go on to the next question. So most people kind of have an idea about these questions, about these broader international issues. The next icebreaker question, are you aware of the National Research Data Infrastructure, or in German, the Nationale Forschungsdateninfrastruktur, NFDI or NFDI, depending on your pronunciation? Have you heard of these things before, or is that an acronym that doesn't mean anything yet to you? So of the 4 people that have made it in there, all of you have heard of that. So this is going to be great. We have relatively high awareness of both the NFDI and of the CBD and its instruments. Great. All right. And with that, I would love to have the scene set, although as it turns out with our icebreaker questions, we actually have pretty broad awareness with our audience here today, but who knows, this is being recorded. And so perhaps in the future, the people that will watch this afterwards might not quite have the same level of awareness. So in order to bridge that gap, what we'd love to have right now is Professor Jörg Obermann, who is the scientific director of the Leibniz Institute DSMZ, where I also work. That's the German Collection for Microorganisms and Cell Cultures. And Jörg is also a professor of microbiology at the Technical University in Braunschweig. So he's going to set the scene for us, despite the high level of awareness that we have with our audience so far. Welcome, Jörg. Go ahead, get us started. You're muted, Jörg. We can't hear you yet. Wonderful.
Is that it?
That was it.
So what we want to do here is today is refer to the current political discussion and raise some awareness of some frictions which arise from the two topics Amber just introduced, and the one being the NFDI and the European Open Science Cloud, for instance, the FAIR data, and on the other hand, the current political discussions on the digital sequence information. And basically, for us scientists, the question is going to be, how will we be able to work in the future? Just for those who might, maybe also later, review this discussion, a very brief description of the basis. So one of the important pieces is was accomplished in 1993. That's a Convention on Biological Diversity, which tried to make sure that there is conservation of biological diversity, that there is the opportunity to sustainably use biological diversity, and also in connection with the two first points, arrive at a fair and equitable sharing of the benefits. And that's called ABS in the slogan, access and benefit sharing. For the latter point, there was an amendment to the CBD, the so-called Nagoya Protocol, and that entered into force in 2014. And this is important in our current discussion, stating that provider countries have sovereign rights over their genetic resources, of course, as was clear from the CBD already, but established compliance mechanisms. So how can you acquire the permission of a provider country to work with the genetic resources of that very country? And there is a control of compliance within Germany based on a EU regulation 511 from 2014 to make sure that this is actually observed by German scientists. Now, what is this friction I was talking about? The question now is whether sequence information, and for our discussion here, mostly nucleotide sequence information, also falls under the term genetic resource. And that has been left out so far from the Nagoya Protocol. And the reason why this is going to be is being discussed is that there is a move, or that's a request of mostly countries from the global south to establish some sort, and particularly also of monetary benefit sharing for the use of this digital sequence information, which might otherwise form a loophole in the Nagoya Protocol, where you could use information from biological diversity without making sure that access and benefit sharing is taking place. At the same time, and this is what could happen in the end, just to illustrate this. So any access to sequence information in the internet, which we are so rapidly and easily using nowadays, could be under control and could be not accessible anymore as we are used to it due to a paywall. On the other hand, we have the FAIR principles. We have the European Open Science Cloud and the National Research Data Infrastructure, which seem to follow exactly the opposite approach. So there is a friction, and the VM symposium today was established and was designed as part of the attempt of the scientific community to provide the essential facts which govern the utilization of DSI and inform politics about the foreseeable consequences. So this is basically the intention of what we're talking and discussing about today. So
wonderful, Jörg. Thank you. That was a great introduction. And I see there's been a whole wave of people that have just joined us. So for those of you that might have missed the first icebreaker questions, hopefully you got enough of the overview that Jörg just provided for us. I think then, Scarlett, if you can go ahead, perfect. And we're doing a little bit of interaction. So throughout each speaker, each block during this lunch symposium, we're going to be asking you some questions. So you might have missed the first two icebreaker questions, but now I want to do a little bit of word cloud. So there's the question: will sequence data at some point be part of a monetary benefit sharing mechanism, be behind a paywall, or what could happen to it? But first, we want to just take a step back and ask, how do you use sequence data in your research? So we're assuming probably most of you are coming out of the microbiology space, but if you click the link in the chat, you can go straight into this poll. And what we'd like to do, go ahead, this is a word cloud, so this is a free text answer that you can give us. Just how do you use sequence data, 5 to 10 words perhaps, and then we'll pull together all of those words in one pretty picture. But while you're thinking about how you use sequence data, what we would like to do is introduce our panel. So if my panel can go ahead and turn their cameras on, and we'll keep collecting your data and letting that word cloud process in the background. So go to the poll, fill it in, and then listen in to the panel introductions. So first, I'd like to welcome Dr. Barbara Ebert. She is the Executive Secretary of the German Federation for Biological Data in Bremen, and she's also the co-speaker of the NFDI for Biodiversity, the Consortium for Biodiversity, Ecology, and Environmental Data. Welcome, Barbara. Next, I'd like to introduce Thomas Greiber. He works at the Federal Agency for Nature Conservation, otherwise known as BFN in Germany. And he is the German competent national authority and heads the group responsible for Nagoya Protocol compliance and checks, including in the academic sector. Then I'd like to welcome Professor Konrad Forstner. Konrad is the head of data science and services at ZB Med in Bonn and at the Information Center for Life Sciences and professor at TH Krohn. He is the co-speaker of the NFDI for microbiota, and we're going to hear about that later. Finally, I'd like to welcome Dr. Christian Böhm. He is a synthetic biologist and is on a seconded national expert to the European Commission within the Directorate General for the Environment in the Multilateral Environmental Cooperation Unit. All right, welcome to all 4 of you. And of course, you've already met Jörg Obermann, and that will make up our panel today. And I'm Amber Hartman-Schultz. I'm the deputy to the director at the Leibniz Institute DSMZ, and I will be asking some tough questions of our panelists here today. All right, so we have now some ideas from the audience here. How do you use sequence data in your research? So we see words like cloning, data mining, microbial ecology, that makes sense, gene expression, homology, metatranscriptomics, microbial interactions, bioinformatics, nanopore sequencing, so lots of different ones. And I'm only seeing, we have about 40 participants, but I'm only seeing 10 people in the interactive poll. This is my first admonishment, and I tell you, I am a dog with a bone. So go ahead and get in that poll for the next questions. There will be another 6 or 7 questions throughout the event. We wouldn't leave no man behind, no woman behind. All right, so what I'd like to do, let's, Scarlett, I think we can go ahead probably, and I see people still jumping into the poll. So we'll let them jump into the poll, but we can maybe stop the screen sharing. And I would first like to turn it over to Thomas, if I could, and ask you kind of a very short and easy question, perhaps for you. So Jörg sort of introduced us to this concept of the Nagoya Protocol and access and benefit sharing, and whether or not sequence data might be underneath or part of the Nagoya Protocol. So can you give our audience just a simple answer? Does the Nagoya Protocol cover digital sequence information? Yes, no, or is there no easy answer?
Thank you very much, Amber, and good afternoon to everybody. No, there's no easy answer, unfortunately. If you look at the legal text, if you look at the Nagoya Protocol, you will not find the term DSI, digital sequence information, anywhere. So basically, you need to interpret the legal text, and as so very often, there are different opinions and perspectives in this interpretation. So on the one side, let's say the more developed industrialized countries and, for example, the EU, have the perspective that it's not covered because the Nagoya Protocol is about access and benefit sharing related to genetic resources, and genetic resources, again, is a term defined in the CBD as genetic material. So we are of the opinion that the Nagoya Protocol is all about material, something tangible, and information data is not tangible. On the other side, then there are the developing countries, and Professor Obermann already explained their perspective a little bit. They are of the opinion, they are also looking at the Nagoya Protocol, and they refer to Article 5, which introduces the obligation related to benefit sharing. And this actually says that benefit sharing obligations or benefits should be shared from the utilization of genetic resources, but also from subsequent applications and commercialization. So something that comes after the initial utilization of generic resources. And many countries, of course, refer to the fact that the digital sequence information is a product of research with the generic resources. So those are the two positions that are clashing. And so we are discussing this further at the international level.
So you gave me the typical German Jein answer. So yes and no, and it depends sort of on your regional or national perspective. But I mean, I guess this actually brings me over to Christian, especially with your background in synthetic biology. I mean, if it's sort of an unresolved area, you know, the temptation as a scientist is to say, okay, well then I don't have a problem. Like, let's just keep trying to say, no, it's not part of the Nagoya Protocol, sequence data should just be in. But why, in your opinion, in your experience, is benefit sharing from digital sequence information becoming an emerging issue? Why are parties sort of unhappy? What are the scientific trends that are making this a gray area, Christian?
Yes, thank you very much, Amber, and good early afternoon to all the people on this call from very dark Brussels, in case you can see my background, as it usually is this time of the year. Well, as Thomas has already outlined, digital sequence information is currently not a well-defined term. So in the course of the negotiations, we're actually working with a placeholder. And right now, it's not yet determined whether that term might actually embrace just nucleotide sequence data or goes beyond that and might embrace metabolite information or other things as well. Regardless, as Thomas has stated before, the European Union does not consider currently DSI to be in scope of the Nagoya Protocol. Other parties do. And for a number of years now, there's been a concern among some parties, especially parties that are very rich naturally in biodiversity, parties which are mostly developing countries, emerging economies, that modern tools of doing molecular biology, including very cheap and easy gene synthesis, sequencing of DNA, as well as synthetic biology tools, may increasingly allow researchers to circumvent or undermine some of the benefit sharing obligations there are. Because I guess as microbiologists, we're all aware that it's quite possible nowadays to head to an ecosystem to read out some genome using a handheld, very small scale device and then upload the information to some cloud. And then researchers from all over the globe can essentially download this information. They can use it to make a plasmid. They can use that to make a product in the end without ever having to access a physical sample. And so now we're in a situation where these parties would like to extend benefit sharing obligations to digital information as well. And we're currently at a point in negotiations where it looks like an overall agreement on the post-2020 GBF, which is short for Global Biodiversity Framework. So the, 10-year strategy towards conserving biodiversity by the UN would be contingent on a compromise on the issue of DSI. And for the European Union, having an ambitious post-2020 global biodiversity framework is a very high political goal. In scope of the European Green Deal, you may be aware of, in scope of the European Biodiversity Strategy 2030. And in addition to these political considerations, we feel there is a chance that a solution to the DSI question may actually make life a bit easier, both for the providers and users in this context. So it might be possible to find a solution that provides higher legal certainty and prevents some of the fragmented landscape we're looking at the moment.
So you ended on a positive note. I mean, you do see then, if I kind of understand you correctly, I mean, although at first blush, right, if I'm a member of the audience and I'm thinking, what, you want to put the sequence data, you want to put GenBank behind a paywall? There's like no happy news there, but you're sort of ending on this, okay, there is the potential that if a good deal was made, that the legal uncertainty, the clarity, the standardization could bring us towards something that simplifies the system, provides some sort of legal certainty. Is that right? And Thomas, do you want to sort of maybe fill in the gap here? I'm thinking about, you know, you've been kind of behind the scenes a bit on the development of the European Union position around DSI. Do you also see what Christian is saying, the opportunity for a deal to be made that could have positive outcomes, or could you explain sort of maybe the political tensions that you observe moving around? Feel free both to answer that question. I kind of shifted back and forth. Yeah.
Yeah, well, hopefully, in the end, there's a positive result. I mean, that's what we're all working for, I would say. I mean, right now at the stage we are, and we are still also due to the corona pandemic, still in a relatively early stage of the negotiation process. There's still many options on the table that parties have suggested. I mean, they are all very vague ideas still, not fleshed out in any detail. And but of course, you can see some which might be more appealing for our researchers and for our objective to maintain the open access than others. And as so very often you see extreme positions also. Of course, there's a simple position held by some countries that basically the digital sequence information should be simply included in the Nagoya Protocol, and then the bilateral system that we have with applying for permitting when you use the digital sequence information should be applied, and benefit sharing should take place with the country of origin of the information, and so on and so forth. So there's quite a broad field, and yeah, the future will tell us how well we can communicate also the benefits that the other side, the developing countries, can also generate from maintaining open access. But the system, I think it's clear, the system as we have it right now will not easily be maintained throughout the negotiation process. So
a bit of unknown, a little optimism, but also some areas for concern. And thank you. I see a comment here in the chat from Andreas Schmidt. Feel free also, maybe more easily for us to manage the questions would be to use the Q&A button instead of the chat, but we'll still take that off. So there's a chat here from the audience about how ownership of research data is defined. I'm going to put that in your heads to kind of come back to, because I wanted to just, before I transition to our NFDE colleagues, I wanted to ask Kristen one more question. And that is simply what, going into the negotiations. So if I understand correctly, there's the Geneva meeting coming here at the end of March. That's sort of a pre-meeting. I think it's in the context of the open-ended working group 3 for the development of the global biodiversity framework. And at that preparatory meeting, the EU will have a negotiating position, right? And I know there's public documents that are available. Kristen, do you think you could give our audience, what is the EU's position going into these international pre-negotiations, if you will? Any high-level ideas would be helpful.
Yeah, sure. I'm very happy to answer that. So as already mentioned, open access is very valuable. It's on the top of our list, if you will, of criteria to evaluate different policy options on the table by. I should preface this by saying that the European Union has not, really narrowed down on any particular option, but what we have done is develop some principles by which to evaluate options currently on the table and new options which may come up over the course of the negotiations. One core principle of our negotiation position I've already mentioned, which is preserving open access to digital sequence information from databases. Mentioning that there currently still is no globally agreed definition of what open access actually means and entails. And from my point of view, open access might be understood as the practice of providing online access to scientific information that is both free of charge, at least to the end user, and without restrictions of use. Mentioning a few other important elements of our current position is that any solution to be adopted should be practical, it should be easy to implement and cost-effective, meaning that it should really generate more benefits than costs in the end. Furthermore, we would like to ensure that the benefits generated will actually contribute to the conservation and sustainable use of biodiversity, thereby also supporting the Sustainable Development Goals, SDGs. We would like any option to be adopted to ensure legal certainty of course, we would like the solution to be future-proof, as to allow further technological developments to be accommodated and not having to overhaul the entire framework once a new technology is developed or circumstances change. And finally, we would like any solution to be adaptable to the requirements of other ABS instruments. There's a number of other benefit sharing schemes beyond the Nagoya Protocol within the Convention of Biological Diversity, where similar discussions are currently ongoing.
That's quite a wish list. I mean, it's a wish list that sounds quite familiar to some of the work that I've done under the Wild DSI project. I think we had a list very similar to that. So I congratulate the EU on a very clever position. But yet that is a wish list, right? So that means that we might not get everything that we want, although we can certainly hope to be clever and good negotiators. And I certainly trust your boss to be just that. But I wanted to turn, this over, especially to Conrad and Barbara and Jörg. You haven't had a chance to comment on this benefit sharing segment. If there's anything else that you'd like to add, either based upon the chat or anything that got triggered here, if you want to add, or Thomas, of course, the last chance to you before we go to the two polling questions. Anything from the three of you?
Well, I think,
yeah.
If I may, there was also a question or a statement posted in the chat. Whether the legal discussions leave the ground of reason, and there was this example about digital photography, for example. And as I replied in the chat box, also there are certain parties and organizations that would like to see such a very broad scope of benefit sharing obligations. And of course, it is in the end very much triggered by the monetary interests of countries with, of course, for example, flagship, species which are being used then in commercials and so on and so forth, without them benefiting in any way. So all to say that this is a very, also to some extent emotional discussion. You can see parallel processes related to cultural goods, where it's all about ownership, sovereignty issues, and monetary aspects. That's all.
Yeah, thanks for commenting on that. I think the question asker was sort of pointing out, like, isn't that absurd to think that also photographies could somehow be questioned? But actually your answer is, you might think that's absurd, but actually there are many countries that would wish for a very broad interpretation of what belongs to them, what's under their sovereign rights. So sort of, teasing out that tension. Jörg, you raised your hand, and then Barbara, and then we'll move over to the questions. Please go ahead.
Yeah, so one interpretation of that very important question is about the extension towards other things than nucleic sequence information. And that has been discussed, as many of us know. The deeper, I understand this question a little bit more deeply with respect to feasibility and realization. Because that question addresses the issue of information in general, and particularly of DSI, and that is one sequence or a couple of sequences are not of any value. The value of the sequence comes from comparison with a wealth of other sequences. So we have not a linear flow of information where you could have a paywall in between, but we do have a flow of information which goes back and forth between 2,000 databases. And the information changes as it goes along these exchanges between databases, on the computers of scientists and so on. So in the end, who is putting that value to the sequence information? And that shows that there is not a problem of scope, but I think there is an inherent and deeper problem of who owes the rights for whatever knowledge is generated, and that you cannot pinpoint to a single country, leaving alone to a single scientist. So I think I understand this question in a somewhat different sense, or second sense, you may say, and far beyond this extension to photography.
Yeah, a fundamental question, which is when does value arise, and therefore when does someone have a legitimate benefit claim, and what are the relevant things that are along the way, and are they ever going to be definable into discrete unions, or is it such an iterative and cumulative process that it'll be impossible to ever say, well, this was the unique thing that created the value? Yeah, it's an incredibly complex question, almost philosophical. Barbara, you had your hand up and then you lowered it. Are you just too excited? Or no, you want to go ahead, jump in? Yeah, go
still
ahead.
Valid. No, just I wanted to add an observation to the discussion regarding the issue of ownership and sovereignty here. That reminds me of similar discussions in the social scientists, where negotiations go back and forth between the data subjects, persons who give personal data to researchers, and the data owners. There's no such concept in the German law that you cannot own data, but usually it's seen that the right of disposal of the research data that is generated in studies is with the institution that generates the data and not with the data subject. And similar, there are negotiations ongoing there to balance the rights of the persons who give personal data for research purposes. That I find quite interesting here, because we have a very complicated situation of the ownership issue and the right of disposal here, where digital sequence information is generated at a very different organization than the country where the genetic resource originally came from, if that is at all reproducible where it came from in the first place.
No, it's fascinating. So, and I agree, there's the famous example of the Henrietta Lacks, the cervical cancer cell line, of course, and then the sort of justice issues, should those things actually belong to her, or the profits that happens made off of them ultimately given back to her family. And so you're pointing out like this idea of ownership, be it in the human side or in the biological diversity side, or in the healthy patient data, patients still alive side, that these issues continue to evolve and these questions of ownership sort of remain unanswered. It's a fascinating observation. Go ahead, Conrad, and then I'm going to turn it over back to our audience. Yeah,
just a very minor issue also regarding ownership of, if we talk about bacterial species, right? I mean, you cannot own a bacteria that is maybe across different countries and so on. So there it becomes even much harder to define this ownership. Just another perspective I would like to add here.
Yeah, no, that's great. And I know that Thomas is probably about to jump in and say, well, the CBD doesn't care about endemism or cosmopolitanism, how far things are distributed. It doesn't really matter. It matters where you found that one thing. But of course, as microbiologists, we've been pointing this out for some time. It's an important issue. Thank you. Although that's also why we have Article 10 that has not yet been implemented in the Nagoya Protocol, which is this cross-boundary issue. All right, Scarlett. We would love, I see, and I'm going to call you out here. Everybody get ready to type in your browser. If I do not get 50 people in this poll, I'll be mad. You don't want a mad moderator. So Scarlett has put the link back in there. All you got to do is click on it. And then, oh, look, there's our word cloud results. We got lots of cloning, lots of microbial ecology and annotation. All right, we're going to go over to our next poll. And we are hopefully going to see a lot more people than 18 over there, because now you all are Minty experts. So if you use the link in the chat, the beauty is you don't have to type in that code extra. It just takes you straight from chat into your web browser. Otherwise, you can manually type in menti.com and then that 8871 code. So the question for you all today is, what are your experiences so far with the Nagoya Protocol and obtaining access and benefit sharing permits? So almost kind of back to where Jörg started us off about talking about the Nagoya Protocol. Have you, has it been working? Have you had experiences? And did sequence data play a role in this? So you can see this is a free text answer. You can answer, have you had experience with the Nagoya Protocol? And you can put a couple of words in here too. That should give you the option there. I only see 4 participants. I think most of you are online. In fact, I know you are, because Zoom requires an internet connection. Can I get more than 5 participants over there? Or even more than 10 would be really elegant. Lovely to see. What are your experiences so far with the Nagoya Protocol and obtaining ABS permits? All right, we've gotten above the 10-person mark of the 100 participants that we have over here today. And has sequence data played a role in any kind of international sampling efforts? Okay, we see people that are saying they have no experiencing yet. There's a lot of no's, some easy, some impossible. First time to know about the Nagoya Protocol. All right, that's great that you're here. Very important to learn about this project, especially if you use international things from outside German borders, then you really need to already know about the Nagoya Protocol. Go over to the BFN website, or Scarlett, maybe you can type in the German Nagoya Protocol Hub website here in the links in the chat, and you can get your first, dip your toe into the Nagoya Protocol waters here. All right, great. Thank you to all of you that came over to the survey. And I think we can move on over to the next question. This one will be a little easier to answer. And that is, are there established workflows for data management and or the Nagoya Protocol at your university or at your research institution? And this is going to move us on over into the NFDI section of our symposium. So you're sitting at a research institute at a university somewhere right now. Do they have anything on workflows for data management? Just research data in general. If you produce, let's say, sequence data or just regular Excel sheets for publication, would you know where to store that research data in your institute? And do you have anything on the Nagoya Protocol at your institute? Anything that's been set up so far? So I see 15 participants in so far. A lot of unsureness, insecurity about whether or not your institute has Nagoya Protocol or data management procedures or workflows in place so far. Great. And again, thank you. I see about a quarter of participants. The easier the question, the easier it is to jump into the survey, I notice, because you kind of have to only click one button. All right. So right now, I'm just going to kind of summarize. I'll let a few more answers trickle in. We're not going to reach any kind of statistical power here today, but that's all right. It's just for fun. So it looks like the majority of people don't know about workflows or procedures, policies for either data or for access and benefit sharing. We have about 5 that know how to manage the research data. They would know that there's a known procedure. About 4 that have something for the Nagoya Protocol. Yes to both. Wow. And then 5 just definitely no, and there is not. So really quite a heterogeneous landscape there from almost 30 participants. And with that, Barbara and Conrad, how do you interpret these data? So first, maybe I should transition to you both. Why are we mixing these two issues here with this question, data management and the Nagoya Protocol? So we've had this interesting discussion here in the first half about the Nagoya Protocol, about ownership of biological diversity, ownership of any kinds of biological data or samples, be it from humans, be it from other things. And you both are leading really large, very well funded by the German government, national research data infrastructures. And this is the reason that the DSMZ wanted to pull these two topics together is almost to say, is one hand talking to the other, right? We have these really important international and national issues around access and benefit sharing. And then we have these really large data infrastructures in probably the 2 sections that are most relevant for this audience today, microbiota and biodiversity. And I wonder, these policies that might or might not exist in a research institute, we clearly see from the answers that this field is still emerging. This is still something that we have a lot of homework to do. We're starting, but we're definitely not all the way there. I wondered, could you give me an idea? We definitely knew from the icebreaker questions, not everybody's heard of NFDI for sure. What are the key objectives of your respective consortia? And does digital sequence information, the sequence data, biological data, play a role in those consortium? I'll let you flip a coin. Who wants to go first? Ladies first. All right, Barbara, go ahead. Tell me about your consortium.
Yes, thank you. I can go first and provide maybe some general background on the concept of an NFDI consortium, because that what makes Conrad's and my my network a bit similar in the first place. because the national research data infrastructure is funded by the German federal government and the Länder. And the idea is to bring together infrastructure providers and research communities to build proper portfolio for the data management and data usage that they need to do research. Because a lot of these efforts that have been funded over the past 10, 15, 20 years in different communities are quite unconnected, and they're not funded sustainably. So the idea was to bring together the IT side and institutions proficient in running such data resources with the scientific communities and there's many tools that have been developed there for practical research needs. So the NFDI consortia are all specialized on research domains, and for NFDI for biodiversity, the domain is biodiversity research. So we are dealing with biodiversity data, ecological data, environmental data from various stakeholders, which we aim to mobilize for further use in science and biological conservation efforts. And practically, it's a network of 50 partners. And what we do is we organize the space between those who produce data and those who reuse data. So there are lots of intermediary roles between those two groups, which provide services and tools that both parties need. For example, repositories, visualization tools, search tools, or terminology services. When we talk about providers, we mean the party that produces the data is often also the data provider, and not the provider country of the genetic resource, for example. So among our partner organizations, there are many which run biomaterial collections, renowned ones, national ones, for example, on plants or animals, and work in the field of taxonomy. So they do large-scale analyses of sequence data from all over the world. They all work internationally. They have collections with material from all over the world. And in a very broad sense, the research data we talk about also includes physical specimens, physical objects, and data that is connected to the physical objects or data that reproduces the physical objects. So many of the use cases in NFDI for biodiversity use case projects are about molecular sequence data, for example, from barcode of life projects, environmental DNA studies, and stuff like that.
That's
so
great.
Nagoya,
That's, yeah. So they're definitely the Nagoya relevant there. So an important German research data infrastructure pooling together a lot of international data. Conrad, a similar situation over at NFDI for microbiota, yes or no?
Yeah, kind of. And we are roughly 10 members and around 50 participating institutions, also with the aim actually to, well, at its core, harvest DSI. So in a way, omics data is exploding in microbiology. Everybody knows who's active in there. And with NFDI for microbiota, we want to give people the means to, well, make use of that data in an efficient fashion and basically make it easy and frictionless to translate omics data into real insights that are useful for humankind. And well, you see already, I talked about frictionless or seamless and so on. This is kind of the opposite of what we are talking about, making artificial borders. So this is, due to this whole discussion is, yeah, due to this overall discussion and panel here is close to our heart, because we see enough friction out there. We see a lot of problems. We see, and this is also maybe one thing that we could take from our little survey here, people sometimes simply don't know what's around and what they need to do. So training is also a key part, and awareness building and community engagement into the whole thing is key for our consortia. Building infrastructure, training people, and also forming standards to make this whole procedure, this whole research process frictionless, seamless, and easy to translate omics data in its broadest sense. And we also heard the interpretation of DSI can go from genomic sequences up to metabolites and so on, and that are all basically entities that we would like to deal with, or that we are working on, and where we would like to help and assist researchers to make their life easier. And basically putting such information behind a paywall is, in our opinion, counterproductive in this case. So that's roughly our job, making life of microbiologists easier by providing infrastructure and training.
So I'm hearing a lot of seamless, interoperable openness. I mean, that's I know also your background is sort of in that. Can either of you perhaps sort of say, how do you bridge this tension between this sort of like open, interconnected mandate, and where you started to sort of tap in, Conrad, on the need to also to do awareness raising to sort of increase the awareness, and then to what extent does that transfer over into, or how do you sort of look into the future? Do your consortia have an obligation or a mandate, as you see it, to your user community to provide whatever might come, from these legal instruments or for others? Do you have a legal information mandate, or do you have a sort of engagement mandate to be involved in these DSI discussions and communicate them with the community? How do you view NFDI's role there? Question to both of you.
Okay, I mean, for us, this is just one part of the overall picture. Clearly, we started to, or with the aim to build the technical foundations. Clearly, the legal foundations are similar important, and whatever comes out of these whole negotiations will need to be translated into that. We cannot build technology around that, unfortunately. So for us, and this is, I guess, part of this whole endeavor here, is raising awareness of the problems that are connected to such changes in legislation. So that is a key part, and the outcome, well, we have to adapt. Once the results are at hand, we have to adapt our solutions to that. Clearly, we hope for openness, because in our fundamental assumption is that openness like transparency and reproducibility are key pillars of research. Clearly, there are certain exceptions if you deal with patient data and so on, but in general, at least for the type of data and research data that we are working with, openness is a fundamental pillar, and we need to defend this also in this legal sense. Then we provide the technical infrastructure for accessing this and processing data easily and so on.
Yeah, that's great. So you definitely see the mandate on sort of the post end once the decisions are made. But Barbara, I don't mean to give you a hard question, but what do you sort of see? And again, maybe a philosophical question. Christian and Thomas certainly indicated to us the decision's not made. There is room for NFDE to engage now. You all both were at an open access workshop that Thomas Greiber invited, that the BFN hosted on this intersection of DSI and open access. How hopeful are you, and do you see a role of the NFDE infrastructures engaging in this dialogue over the next few months and beyond, to sort of proactively say this is the needs of, at the very least, the German community, but perhaps bigger than that? What is your personal sort of view on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is, as Conrad said, if rules and regulations come, we have to implement them, because we're not above the law, right? So, but we are also advocates for science. So wherever we see potential negative effects on science, and we always think science internationally on a global scale. All of our stakeholders are heavily engaged in international collaboration, and that is especially true for the biodiversity domain. So if we see developments that are potentially harmful for this international scientific community that we try to serve, then we will, of course, raise our voice. And that is indeed a point here with the digital sequence information. I mean, genetic information has been heavily negotiated. I don't know who knows the history of the big genome databases we know today, but they started with the Human Genome Project, where heavy negotiations were between the the corporate actors in the field who try to be the first to sequence the whole human genome, and the scientific community, that this data should be open. That were the Bermuda principles, that each sequence should be put into a public repository within 24 hours or so of generation, whatever. But, and that evolved into the practice we have today in the biological sciences, that sequence data is published and is given to the scientific domain, to the commons. And that is at stake here right now. And that is why science is so concerned. We know, and because we work in these countries and with these countries, we respect the core issue of genetic resources and benefit sharing. That is not at question. That is not questioned at all. But we are concerned that solutions being found may be harmful also to science, and that will also affect the scientific communities in those countries.
Yeah, I agree. That's great to hear. Conrad, go ahead. So what I'd like to do, get your answer, and then we're gonna do 2 audience polls, and then I'm gonna turn over to Jorg for sort of a last word, and then Thomas on sort of an outlook on just the timeline up ahead over the next few months. Okay, just a sort of signpost how we're going to wrap up the next 7 minutes for our audience. Go ahead, Conrad, please.
Yeah, just it's only a brief addition to Barbara's statement, which I completely agree, because we are not harming our science, but science is, as Barbara mentioned, international. So even the countries that are trying to benefit or trying to get or gain more benefits out of this new negotiations, they will suffer from that, because their own researchers have the same access issues later on. So we would like to spread the awareness of these issues here and hopefully maintain the current situation, meaning free open access to these sequences in order to enable researchers to do their work most efficiently.
Excellent, thank you for that. Scarlett, do you want to go ahead? We got 2 last polls. Again, that's that same link that's there in the chat. And that first question is, again, talking about open access in sort of a more granular way. We didn't get into this in our panel discussion, but what we've been doing here at the DSMZ and together in collaboration with the NFDI consortia is talking about open access criteria. And if you look into the literature, there's a couple of different important criteria: anonymous access, free access, meaning no cost, interoperability, no restrictions on use or downstream use, and then no tracking and tracing. And these are all different things that one might have to compromise on over the course of negotiations. But what's the most important to you personally, just from your personal interactions of these things: anonymous access, free access, interoperability, no restrictions or no tracking and tracing? We'd love to get your feedback on what do you value the most for the kinds of work that you do with sequence data. Think back to that word cloud that we saw earlier and the different purposes for which you use it. I remember seeing genome annotations. I remember seeing cloning. I remember seeing microbial diversity, microbial ecology. What is so important for you? I see an emphasis here on free, also then no restrictions and interoperability, with the tracking and tracing and the anonymous access sort of being not as highly ranked. Great, we're getting great participation there. I'm realizing now as the time continues to advance that it takes a lot of time to do these polls. And I want to give our last 2 questions still. All right, let's go ahead and then move on to the next question, specific to the NFDI consortia that you just heard from. Do you, as a user from the microbial community, do you expect the NFDI consortia to facilitate access to data, so the research data that you need, to data along with legal information, to both, or none of the above? Do you have any expectations for the NFDI consortia? Are you a user, none of the above, both, the data or the legal information? What do you sort of understand, if you're familiar with the consortium, as their mandate? What would you need from the research data infrastructures as a user? What would be important to you based on the conversations that we've heard today? And as we kind of let those last answers trickle in, Jorg, I wanted to give a question over to you. Let's see. Yeah, Scarlett, I think we can wrap it up. It's always hard to juggle getting your feedback in from the audience. you kind of listened in. So the DSMZ is of course involved heavily in the Nagoya Protocol and the DSI issues, and we're also involved in these two NFDI consortia. So I'm wondering what your reactions were to what Barbara and Conrad heard, and also sort of, you know, the bigger picture question marks that you might have about risks and opportunities around this DSI discussion, given what you've heard over the last 30-45 minutes.
I think as a researcher, we all first consider how this affects our own work. So it might be that we won't be able to identify possible functions or related sequences for a gene simply, or we might not be able to do an analysis of community composition of a microbiome, for instance. That's what comes to mind to a researcher. But if we expand our view to the global perspective, it becomes even more serious. As COVID-19 has told us, it's questionable whether we will be able to recognize novel and emerging diseases reliably and in time without an open access. It is questionable whether we will have opportunities to monitor endangered species or to monitor something like chytridiomycosis, that's a difficult word, of amphibs worldwide, which is killing amphib populations in remote settings, in rainforests, and which was only possible to recognize where it came from and how it spread by the comparative analysis of the genome of that fungus across worldwide collections and worldwide holdings. So that opens the perspective that we need to find a solution which is not implementing barriers to the flow of information. The most dramatic consequences I actually see, and that has been mentioned in some of the discussion contributions we had, is that it might backfire severely on the original intention. That is, counterintuitively, the Global South might actually have less access to essential information and might not be able to build up an infrastructure which is so essential for bioeconomy, for health, and so on, because of these paywalls which are implemented. And this is exactly the opposite to what was envisioned. I think based on all these considerations, based on what we have discussed, there is basically one solution which would fit this best. And that is not to couple the use, the access to DSI, to some sort of direct monetary benefit sharing, but to find a multilateral solution which provides incentives, which provides also monetary contributions to those countries which contribute digital sequence information based on this contribution, but uncoupled from what scientists and others are actually using and accessing in the database. So a multilateral uncoupled access which implements a fund which can provide sufficient also monetary benefits to those which really need them would probably be this tangible solution to what we have been talking about.
That's great. So I hear some concern, but then also some optimism, which is a great note to end a lunch symposium on. Thomas, I'm going to give you the last word. I know you're going to be traveling down to Geneva here in a few weeks, and maybe you can just sort of outline for those of us that are going to be, following on Twitter what might come along. What's the timeline here? When are we going to know what the decision was on DSI? And Kristen, of course, feel free to jump in. But when are we going to know what about DSI?
Yeah, another difficult question where I don't have a clear answer, unfortunately. The parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity, to the CBD, had already agreed in 2018 that the next conference of the parties, which is the decision-making body for this international process, should take a decision how to address DSI in this global biodiversity framework that we heard earlier about, which is the strategy which is supposed to be developed until 2030 and 2050, how to achieve the broader goals, conservation, sustainable use, but also benefit sharing. So as we all know, Corona somehow changed the timeline for all of us, and the Conference of the Parties did not take place as initially planned in 2020. Now we are a bit delayed. You mentioned the Geneva meeting, which will take place in March, in 4 weeks from now, I think, where we will start or continue negotiating and discussing the subject. And then the Conference of the Parties at the moment is planned, or there are discussions about holding it in September, October in China. I think we will not see an international instrument, the solution at that point in time, but we will need to come up with some first agreements on basic criteria and so on and so forth. And then I expect the negotiation process to continue. How long that's going to take, we don't know. But I think regardless of this international process, it's what we also see is that at the national level, more and more countries in the meantime decide to include DSI in their national access and benefit sharing laws, with the attempt to controlling and monitoring and getting hold of the benefits from this side. So yeah, stay tuned and
so it could take a while, Ari. And Christian, go ahead, wrap that up for us.
Sure. Senator Thomas actually mentioned most of the points I was going to make anyway. For the upcoming meetings in Geneva in March, we're not expecting the issue of DSI being resolved. What we can confidently expect is that we can agree among the parties on what is realistically achievable, on what approach, step-by-step approach to take in the further process, and hopefully, well, become a bit better at identifying convergencies and divergencies between the different parties.
Yeah.
So it looks like the issue of DSI, or the solution to the DSI issue, will be part of an overall compromise embracing the entire GBF, and as Thomas indicated already, is not to be expected before the COP15 at the earliest.
So you guys have your work cut out for you in the next few months, for sure. We had 2 more audience polls, but in light of the time, I think I'm going to thank my panelists and thank you, the audience, for hanging out this long with us. I'm sorry we couldn't get quite as many polls. This was also being live tweeted, so look over at the Leibniz Institute DSMZ's Twitter account, and you can also look at Andrew Houghton. He's been live tweeting throughout this, and you can flash back to any of the highlights of this symposium. Thank you all for being here, and we look forward to the next VOM symposium in person, where we will update you on these and other issues. Thank you to everyone. Take care and bye-bye.
Thank you.
Take care. Bye.
Thanks a lot.